Live. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of my Justice in Pieces series. Today's guest, very prominent councillor here in Ward 12 in Toronto. So thank you very much, Councillor Josh Matlow, for joining us. How are you doing this evening?
I'm relatively well despite it all, and facing the challenges that we all have, and everybody's got layers going on, but feeling very grateful for the fact that my family is well, and we're dealing with what comes.
So can you tell maybe a little bit of background about yourself for my students who may not know of you, or how did you get into politics? What made you decide politics was for me?
It's a good question. I mean, if you ask my parents, they would tell you that I've been in politics since kindergarten. When I was never passive about issues that affected my life. I always wanted to have an opinion. I always wanted to be part of the discussions. And then throughout my childhood, I'd get involved in, just be active in different issues that I cared about, whether it be environmental issues, social justice issues, issues in our community. And I've just was always active about things that I cared about. And then I guess it wasn't a surprise to anyone who knew me when finally I just gave up on trying to convince politicians to do the right thing, but decided to go and try to be one myself and be the model of politics that I expect from others. So it wasn't sort of a deliberate choice. It was more just a natural progression of fighting for things that I cared about throughout my life, and then eventually having a job that I get to do that every morning.
So how would you compare being on the opposite end, right? About when and I was there advocating, and now I'm the one people are advocating to. How would you kind of reconcile that?
It's, in many ways it's similar, because you're still campaigning for causes that you care about, and you're trying to convince others to agree with you and work with you on them. But I also learned a lot about what I thought I was doing right, and I clearly was not. Better understanding what gets my attention as an elected official and what does not, and how I'm influenced and how I'm convinced. And if I could go back and teach my activist self, better ways to reach out to politicians and try to get them to do things, I have a lot to teach my earlier self.
So how is that all happening right now with you, with the city of Toronto, COVID-19? How is the city being run during these times, and how are people able to get to Councillor Matlow, get into his ear when they can't meet you in person as much as they could have 6 to 12 months ago?
Yeah, well, the when COVID first really hit Toronto, I was maybe the first politician to have to go into quarantine in early March, because I'd come in close contact with somebody who had been tested positive. So my experience was that I ended up living in my basement for 2 weeks, even before the country shut down. So the schools were still open. Life was still relatively normal, although we were giving fist bumps more than handshakes. And from my basement, I would watch the kids go to school. And then all of a sudden, a few days later, that stopped. And then all of a sudden the NBA shut down, and all these things just kind of, I think, made it abundantly clear that the world was about to change. But even from my basement, I was still, and even in the midst of this, personal and professional traumatic experience, and all of us were going through our own journeys at that time through it, people are still getting to me. Yes, they couldn't meet me in person, but whether it be social media, whether it be email, phone, people were tweeting at me. The world was still with me, and I was still with them, even though I was trapped in my basement for 2 weeks. And, subsequent to that, I still receive, without exaggeration, hundreds of emails every single day, and social media. And, and now that we are able to walk through the streets and, maybe not congregate, but at least still be out there and see people, I see people all the time in the neighborhoods that I represent, even if it's from 6 feet apart. And I'm still able to kind of pick up on the local, hey, what's going on there? What are you doing about that? Have you heard about this? Still, when I do my grocery shopping, I'm recognized slightly less because I've got a mask on when I do it. And I've grown a beard since the pandemic started, because really, when else is there a better time to grow a beard? But I'm still engaged, but also importantly, our community is still engaged with me, because I think even more than ever, people want to feel connected, and they want to feel connected to their representatives and feel like a community, especially at a time when we're asked to be apart from each other. I think there's a real longing for us to be close because we're not physically able to.
Now, you mentioned being in the basement there. What was that experience like in terms of what advice perhaps you can offer those who are in or have gone through self-isolation to kind of better get through that? And even my students who are, we're not as connected being in person anymore. What got you through that quarantine period?
It's important to discuss that really, openly, because we are living in a reality where more and more of us are going to have to self-isolate and stay away from people when we are feeling ill, or if we believe that we've been in close contact with somebody who's been tested positive, or or we've come back from somewhere else. And the first thing is, just remember that life doesn't pause. Whether you are having a remarkable trip somewhere else in the world, or having some wonderful adventure, or in your basement, or in your apartment, or wherever you live, your life is still happening. So just because you've had to pause your schedule and you've had to pause the structure of your life, you're still alive, and your relationships still matter, and your well-being matters. And that's why it's really important to take care of your mental health and your physical health. So what did I do? I mean, my basement isn't big. So I would literally I'd be on the phone, and I'd walk back and forth and back and forth. And I would have come across like a zoo animal, really. Like the way that if you look through the window, that's what I would have looked like. But what I was doing is that I've got an Apple Watch, with those rings, and I had a goal. Every single day I was going to close those rings. I was not going to become physically unwell, especially at a time when we need to be the best we've ever been to get through a public health crisis. And I also made sure that while I listened to the news and I was wrapped up in this whole dystopian sci-fi movie that the world had become, I didn't obsess over it. In other words, I mean, we all did, but I would create space to read about something else, to talk with friends, not just about crisis, but to just say, I love you, and how are you? And how, let's maybe spend time that we wouldn't have otherwise, but now we really need to connect. And I guess ultimately, if you need to self-isolate for a couple of weeks, love yourself, care about yourself, be physically well, be mentally well, and also recognize that, you're going to be out of there in a couple of weeks. And there are many other people in our society who are isolated even during normal times. And I always knew that I had people I loved to come up to eventually. And that's what kept me, relatively well. And I danced a lot.
So what are the challenges facing your residents in Ward 12 right now with, we've talked about COVID-19, but what specifically are you hearing from them, and what can be done about those challenges?
There are so many layers because we have COVID-19 and we have a global pandemic, which means that many of our civil liberties have been restricted. Our ability to enjoy the quality of life that we remember has been restricted. Our ability to do simple things like even give people hugs has been restricted. And for many people, they've lost their businesses. Their kids have been at home. Either it's been a pleasure or they've driven them crazy. Some families like each other, some don't. Some have had to deal with relationships that they're not happy in, and now they've been trapped together. Everyone's got a different story. And it's interesting that I've talked to probably thousands of people since this began, and everyone's got a journey. Everyone's got some trauma. It just depends on different degrees. Some people have just been really stressed and feeling awful about it, and other people have like literally lost everything, all their money, and some people have lost people. They've had a mom or a grandfather die due to COVID-19. So everyone's got their own story, and it's at different degrees. So they need to know that every level of government is on their side and really trying to protect them and support them in every possible way, both, again, physical health and mental health, and economically. And they also want to make sure that they want to know that governments are making decisions based on factual and evidence-based advice rather than politics, especially now, but always. They want to know that if you're a tenant, that your government isn't going to allow you to be evicted because you lost your job. And it's not that you don't want to pay the rent, you just can't pay the rent. If you're a small landlord, you want to know that there's going to be an offset program to make sure that you can still make your mortgage and be kind to your tenants. Same goes for commercial tenants. You want to know that that the decision about schools are going to be done in a way that's practical but expedient, but also doesn't cut corners, and to make sure that people can go to work and have their kids educated, but at the same time, not in a way where they're put into risk unnecessarily as well, including childcare. I mean, everyone's facing sort of their own challenges. And I think mostly people are just trying to figure out how to function when the world has become dysfunctional. And then there's the things that happen even when this isn't happening, but with everyone at volume 11, it's difficult to deal with. Our wards became double the size a couple of years ago because Doug Ford cut the number of councillors virtually in half. So in our ward in particular, we have about 110,000 people. I often joke, most of whom I hear from every single day. And there are issues going on, COVID or no COVID, controversial developments that affect the quality of life of the neighborhood, whether or not we're going to get a park, whether or not we're going to get a childcare center, whether or not we're going to get infrastructure, social services, school capacity. And then all of that then takes on a prism of what does that look like in the new COVID-19 reality? There's an opioid crisis in our city, and there's people living on our streets and tents popping up in parks everywhere throughout the city. At the same time, there are shelters coming up in my community, for example, where there are real life problems when needles are being left in the parks and the playgrounds, and people are struggling with feeling unsafe due to what the city is trying to do to answer other problems. So all these things are happening all at the same time. And then of course I get calls from people, who want to get a parking pad on their front lawn or a tree pruned or whatever it might be. And those day-to-day issues need to continue being addressed as well. So I guess to sum it up on that one, it's, whether it be transit, childcare, bike lanes, road safety, controversial developments, all the different things that we normally deal with, affordable housing, affordability in general. Then you've got civil unrest. You've got the Black Lives Matter movement happening in a way that hasn't been as accepted perhaps by society before and understood. And it still has a journey to be understood. I've had to learn to understand it better and act on it. And all this is happening all at the same time. So it's a lot. It's a lot for the average person. We're all going through a lot. But I just want to remind everyone who's listening on an optimistic note. I think it's also fair to say that what the normal was before wasn't working for a lot of people. We weren't able to talk about mental health as honestly as I think most of us do today. And elder abuse in our long-term care homes and how safe they are and well they are or unwell they are. And we weren't able to talk about active transportation in a way that wasn't as absurdly controversial. And we weren't able to talk about civil rights and reforms needed to institutions like the police to ensure that when we talk about getting through this together, we mean everyone and we include everyone. So while this is a stressful time of transition, I'm also very optimistic, and I believe that a new normal can be better than the old normal if we choose to make it so.
So a lot to unpack there, but you just mentioned the new normal. So let's say we flash forward, like a TV series, 6 months from now. What is this new normal like? If in Councillor Josh Mallow's world, what do you see if you had the opportunity there?
What is the new normal? Um, it's a new normal where we recognize that our connections to each other are so deeply important that, our handshake was a formality. And I don't know if we're ever going to get the handshake back or not. But what's more important is to understand that we are interconnected. What happens with one person in another country can affect another person in a neighboring country and then affect people around the world. That's what a virus does. But the same goes for kindness, and the same goes for how we affect each other with all sorts of decisions we make every day. We need to remember that we are interconnected and we are interdependent. And I believe this new normal can be a new normal where we start really seeing each other better, where we recognize that public policy decisions we all make need to consider everyone, not just the people who, paid for election campaigns. And we've got to remember that. I think the new normal is going to be seeing us spending more time in green spaces, whether it be trying to, if we are able to, escape the city sometimes and spend time in Algonquin Park and places like that. But there's a lot of people in our city who don't have that access. And we also need to make sure that we have parks and open spaces that are accessible and safe and welcoming for people, because there are going to be days when we've got movie theaters, but there's going to be days when they may not be open. And I think we've already seen that people are going to our parks and going to our trails, going to our ravines. And I think the new normal is going to be maybe in a positive way about, when, even when we have to spend time at home, when we do go out, it'll be more about connecting with nature, which is good for us. I think the new normal is sadly going to be spending more time doing this on screens. But that's why I'd also encourage you and your students to remember that this is a tool. I mean, it's a good thing that we've got this. It would be more frustrating if we didn't. But try to take time every day to go for a walk, go to those parks, walk in the ravines, or if you're self-isolated like I was, jog around your apartment or your basement. But I think the new normal is going to be about trying to take care of ourselves in that way. And then lastly, I think our new normal is going to have to really consider how we create space. In other words, the public space, but also even office space, and really understand when we need to be physically distant. How do we do that in a safe way that's still functional? In other words, how do we get the best out of the old normal, the functional stuff, the fun stuff as well? And how do we make it work with the new reality that we didn't ask for, but we have to pragmatically deal with? So I don't want us to continue living in a state of just anxiety or a state of loss where, oh, I wish I could do this or I wish I could do that. I want us all to be able to have a great quality of life, but in a safer way. So as a metaphor, maybe, gone are the days of open buffets. But also, I mean, was that really a good idea in the first place? I love buffets, but really, when you actually think about it, people are coughing and sneezing on our food all the time. Maybe we'll learn some things and make a better normal that's safer and structure our society in a way that still allows us to be close, but considers the fact that we shouldn't maybe be coughing and sneezing and breathing on each other the way that we used to.
Well, I wish we can press fast forward and get to that new normal,
Yeah,
Councillor. But I mean, unfortunately, right now, I mean, one of the things you mentioned there is Bill 148 there, and what's going to happen now for tenants in Ward 12 in particular that they may be facing evictions because they just happen to be caught in a bad situation here.
Yeah. So I'm very concerned. There could be thousands of tenants who are facing eviction. and to facing eviction quicker due to the Ford government's bill 184 that really allows evictions to go through, even though we're not out of a pandemic. And the premier actually said earlier in the pandemic, and I think he was coming across quite well. I remember hearing from a lot of even progressive people that they were impressed that Doug Ford was sounding uncharacteristically empathetic. And Doug Ford promised tenants in Ontario that he said, I'm your premier, and I'm, to paraphrase, I'm going to protect you. And I'm not going to let you be evicted, and I'm going to take care of you. And what he did is that he has supported a bill that would make it easier to evict tenants. And what I've been saying publicly about this, and I'm rallying people and I'm asking people to sign a petition that I organized, is tenants did their part when the Ontario government asked them to stay home. And now I think that the government has a responsibility to ensure that tenants keep their homes. And we might go through a second wave this fall or winter. And it may be, I don't want to predict this, and I don't want this to happen, but it's reasonable to expect that there might be a second wave and that we might have to spend more time in our homes. Do we really want to see thousands of people in Ontario, to no fault of their own, end up on the streets? That's not acceptable, and that shouldn't be an option. And I believe that collectively we need to do everything we can to avoid that and take care of each other. It is amazing how this government and every politician you talk to uses the rhetoric about getting through this together. That should mean all of us, not just some of us, not just those that are our political base, not just people who look like us, not just people who go to our tennis clubs or whatever like that. It's all of us. And we as a public need to demand that our governments live by those words.
Now, you mentioned the possibility of a second wave, and I'm going to be cautiously optimistic, but what do you say to small business owners or restaurants in your ward who are trying to get through this, and they want to see us move through stage 3 and stage 4 and kind of return to normal business operations, but at the same time maintain proper social distancing? We've seen the new mandatory mask laws indoors. What are you seeing in terms of kind of finding the right harmony between opening up for businesses so they can recover, but at the same time trying to prevent a second wave from happening?
Well, I definitely think that what we've done as a city recently, for example, to provide patio space on our curb lanes for restaurants and cafes is such an important part of their success, because they have limited capacity. They have capacity restrictions. They're not allowed to have people, as part of phase 2, dine inside. And at least for the warm months, probably up until October, although you never know, maybe we'll get lucky this year, but up until it gets cold, that'll work, or at least help. Doesn't answer everything, but it helps. I'm concerned that, while we absolutely want to provide opportunities for those restaurants and bars to have people inside, that if we do it too hastily and if we do it in a way that isn't safe, we will see what we've seen in other jurisdictions, which is a spike. Because in bars in particular, what has been demonstrated is that most people who go to restaurants, if they space it out and if you're several feet apart, you typically are going with your own social circle. So it is that mitigates it. For bars, they should not allow people to gather at the bar. They should be treated like restaurants, where you have to be at tables, stay at your table, and be distant, because that is safer. That being said, the concern that needs to be said out loud is that the evidence has demonstrated that when people are outside, and especially outside and with physical distance, there is a very low chance of transmission of the virus. However, what experts will tell you is that when you are indoors And then especially if you are in indoor congregate settings, the risk of transmission is even higher. And then of course, when you add on people with who are over the age of 70 and with pre-existing conditions, you get what we've seen in many of our long-term care homes, which have been just tragedies where the virus has spread like wildfire. But we have seen spikes in other jurisdictions where people have been gathering at bars, and that needs to be considered as part of the provincial government's plan for stage 3. I would rather see, I recognize that these businesses need to survive, but I think it should be done in a really careful way, especially through the cold months in the fall, where you have tables that have distance, and even where they can put physical barriers or dividers, anything that can be done to make them as safe as possible should be done. And no matter what, they shouldn't allow people to gather at the bar. That's a good way for everyone to breathe on each other. We know how people behave at bars. By the way, I know this, I'm not sounding fun, but pandemics are not fun. And also when you drink, often your judgment is impaired. You think that you can get away with things that you don't typically consider, or you would consider better rather if you were not drunk. And I think we just have to be really careful about it. And that goes for movie theaters and the rest.
Now, switching gears, you mentioned in terms of, and you brought a motion actually at City Hall to cut funding to the Toronto Police earlier this month. Can you explain to my students, what was your hope with bringing this motion, and maybe you could explain what was contained within it?
Thank you. So I brought a motion recently to Toronto City Council, which was not approved, to defund, or in words that I know a lot of people are familiar with, reallocate, reinvest, cut 10% of the police budget from the Toronto Police budget and reinvest it into areas like much needed community supports that have been underfunded for many years in our neighborhoods, along with alternatives to policing, to provide, frankly, better approaches to many calls that police currently answer. There's a movement that I think a lot of people have heard about, which has been demonstrated on the streets throughout the United States and Canada and around the world. It has become very prevalent since the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. But as people in our Black and Indigenous and communities, people of color in our city have told me and reminded me, it's in the States, but it's not just in the States. There have been many people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Toronto and throughout Canada who have been brutalized, who have been profiled, who have been carded, who have been treated differently because of what they look like. And I went through a journey where I would have told you a couple of months ago that I thought defunding the police was this radical concept. But the more that I listened and the more that I allowed myself to learn, and the more that I recognized that as somebody with white skin, when I walk through my neighborhood at night, I have a different experience than somebody who might be 20 years old and Black. I don't have to worry about anyone stopping me, asking me why I'm walking through my own neighborhood. But if I was a young Black person, the likelihood is that that might happen. And more than that, I don't know where that stop could escalate to. Far too many have seen that end up in tragedy. It doesn't mean that every police officer is a racist. There are some remarkable police officers we have in Toronto. And it doesn't mean that every person of color is going to have a bad experience with the police. But I am convinced that there's systemic, that there's structural racism within our police and most every institution that we have in society. There's less a likelihood, frankly, that a white person is going to be watched as close in a convenience store than a young Black person. This has existed for decades, and we've never properly addressed it as a society. So the anger that we're hearing and the calls for change, I think, are justified and understandable. What we do with it is really important. And I'm of the opinion that we need to make actual structural change. There are so many examples of where there are calls that come in through 911 where the police are the ones who are responding to it because that's the way it's always been. But I think it's reasonable to ask, if you're going through a mental health crisis, are the police the best ones to do that? Or would you be better served by a social worker or a public health nurse? Do these situations escalate because the police have arrived there and they are in uniform and have weapons? Or would that individual be better served by somebody with the knowledge base to attend to their needs? And would the situation be, well, would it help de-escalate the situation by somebody who's not in uniform with a gun? Somebody who's there and they're looking like they're there to support them rather than to get them. These are important questions to ask. There are examples around the world where those approaches have worked better. And I would say the same thing for, let's say a vulnerable young Black man might be better served by hearing from a youth worker first, maybe with a shared lived experience and who could relate to what they're going through, than a bunch of cops showing up at their door. Especially if they have a friend who had a really bad experience with the cops 2 weeks before. These things are real. And I know it's hard to accept it, but it is real. And I think it's really important for those of us in power to not just say, we want to fight racism, but then do something about it if we've learned that it's true. So I moved a motion to ask, and by the way, it was a request of the police board to show us how we could cut 10%. And then that money would have gone through the prism of our social development staff and the anti-Black racism unit staff and other relevant city staff to come forward with council with the best recommendations on how to reinvest those funds into proven methods to improve the communities and improve the service that people get when it comes to community safety. It wasn't about, some people called me and said, do you just want to get rid of the police? This is going to be anarchy. This is going to be chaos. What are you doing? And there are people in the Black Lives Matter movement that are calling for that. But that's not what I was calling for, because I haven't seen a model yet that fully has just successfully experienced just getting rid of the police altogether. There are things that we want the police to do, and we want them to do it well. But I think that there are many interactions with our communities that would be better served. They would be better served by having people who are more knowledgeable and better trained to address their needs, including sex workers, people with addiction, people on our streets, than just assuming that a police officer should be the one to go and knock at their door.
Now, unfortunately, your motion was defeated. So what are the next steps that you can go back to City Hall and say, well, how about we try something different, since we're not going to cut funding to the police, so that we don't have situations like, Ijaz Chowdhury repeating themselves, right? Whether it's on mental health supports, whether it's on addiction supports, whether it's just on systemic racism. What do you propose now? You're going to go back to the drawing board. What's next for you, Councillor Matlow, in tackling this issue?
Thank you. And by the way, with respect to Ijaz Chowdhury, that the police officer has been requested to speak to the SIU, and he's refusing to do so. Imagine if you had a relative who was suffering with a mental health challenge, and a bunch of cops just bashed through the back door and started shooting. I mean, that can't continue. There are better ways to help people who are going through crisis and help their families. And I'm going to continue advocating for this approach because I'm convinced that it's the right thing to do. But I'm also cognizant that, I'm a white guy, and I can't, nor should I, be doing things in a way where I'm telling our communities what they need. My job is to hear what our communities need and be their representative. And as long as I'm elected, ensure that I'm a vehicle for their voices to be heard right at the table. So I'm spending a lot of the summer having those conversations, talking with people who are involved in our communities directly throughout our city, and including my own community, right in Midtown Toronto, and really understanding where we want to go, and then more to come. But I'm convinced that the change that we've just discussed is inevitable. I don't believe that in 10 years or 15 years or however long it'll be, community safety and policing will look exactly the way it does today. And every movement has had to incur some incremental change. But I do believe that we're going to get there. And I guess the question will be for this mayor and council, are we going to look back at our time with that power and with that privilege? And were we the ones that helped make that change? Or will it have to be those who replace us? And we're going to have to make a decision soon.
Okay, so thank you very much, Councillor, for taking the time to join us today. And my students here have been studying admirably under less than optimal conditions. They're concerned about their internships because they may not get in-person ones. They may be concerned about OSAP coming up if there's no jobs that can happen for them. Now, what advice can you offer them in getting through this and completing their studies and moving on from this? And perhaps, if they wanted to get into politics themselves, what could you offer them in terms of getting through this and getting through that new normal that you so eloquently outlined earlier for us?
Oh, well, thank you. To all of you, like I said earlier, I know that each one of us is going through our own struggles and journeys and challenges. And I know that it's a layer because many of us were already having our life challenges and issues, and then now this has come and it's become even worse. So I just want to reiterate what I said earlier and expand on it. Your lives have not paused. Yes, there are more obstacles to jump over. There are more hurdles. There are more frustrations. There are more, more things we have to do sometimes to get to that simple place that we were trying to arrive at, whether it be put a mask on when we go into a store or have to figure out a system that is now having to reinvent itself when it comes to education and funding you through your education. But my best advice to you is, what you want to do. You want to complete your education. You want to be successful. You want to be happy. You want to be healthy. You want to be fulfilled. So take some time now to reflect on your goals. Who do you want to be? Where do you want to go? What do you want to achieve? And what really makes you happy in life? And just remember, the world has always been complicated, and there's always been various hurdles we've had to overcome. And now we've got a new set that are being changed in real time. But you will achieve your goals if you just keep looking at each obstacle and facing it and navigating your way through it, and you will get there. And if government doesn't respond to you or set up the system in a way that supports your quality of life and the people you love around you, then you either can demand that change and organize with people and campaign on those priorities, or you can become government, you can become politicians and then change it from within. That's what I'm trying to do. And if any of you ever want to, know more detail about even how do you start and how do you knock at doors and how do you do all that, feel welcome to reach out to me, send me an email, and I'd always be happy to talk with you if you were serious about that path, because some of us have to be outside knocking at the door, but then we also need people inside to unlock the door and let everybody in.
Perfect. So thank you very much for taking the time and chatting with us today. We really appreciate you reaching out. And one of the things, certainly with COVID-19, one of the big positives is that we've had great opportunities to have people like you connect with our classroom that we would have never had or never had as much of in person normally. So again, turn those lemons into lemonade, as you would say.
It's a good way to live. Well, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to join you.
All right, all the best. Good luck with everything, Councillor.
Thank you, and stay safe and stay healthy.